Okay, well, we seem to be getting some good attendance coming in now, so I'm going to start the webinar. So first of all, welcome everyone. Before we get started today, we want to let you know, if we just look at the next slide, that this webinar will be translated into Spanish, and the instructions for doing that are going to be shown on the screen now. Milena, if you can just show us the next slide. So there we are for our Spanish-speaking colleagues. Next slide, please, when you're ready. Anyway, so welcome to this webinar. We're going to be talking about today about the 2022 Climate Policy Opportunities for a Healthy Future. It's the first in our Global Climate and Health Alliance policy webinar series this year. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm Alison Cox. I'm the GCHA Policy and Advocacy Director. And we wanted to hold this webinar to hear from some leading experts working on policy issues that will be key for health and climate change in 2022. The health community working on climate change has been growing rapidly over recent years, and by hearing from some of these experts on today's call, we can learn more about some of the policy issues and where we can engage more effectively. I'm delighted to say that we've already got over 100 people online joining us today. So thank you all for joining us. And please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and just say your name and where you're from to give us a flavour of where we're getting the audience from today and who's all joining us. If you find this webinar helpful, your organisation is welcome to sign up as a GCHA member. It's free and you'll receive access to similar events that we run in the future. And sometimes these will be for a smaller audience. So we're going to post the link in the chat now for how to apply as an organisation to be a GCHA member. In the meantime, like I said, please do introduce yourselves in the chat and say where you're from. And once the presentations start, if you have questions for the panelists, please do post them in the dedicated Q&A area. And you can see the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen. That's where we want to collect questions for the panelists, and we'll be able to address some of them directly after each presentation, hopefully, scheduling allows, and then we'll also have a longer time for Q&A at the end, we hope. So questions to the panelists, please put in the Q&A. Any other thoughts or observations or links, you're welcome to use the chat function. So next slide. So just to tell you a little bit about the programme today before I hand over, we're very grateful to the expert speakers who are going to join us today. The topics that they're going to cover will build on those that provided the focus for the Healthy Climate Prescription. The global health community has already expressed very strong support for these priorities. The prescription letter was signed by organisations around the world representing 46 million health professionals and workers, around 3/4 of the total healthcare workforce worldwide. Jess is posting the link to the prescription in the chat box if you want to refresh your memory about the content of that, or if you haven't already signed, please do join. You can sign as an individual or as an organisation. As a reminder of the content of the letter, the figure on the left-hand side of the slide just shows the policy calls made in the prescription, and like I said, there's a link to the full text in the chat box. The pillar diagrams on the right show how these priorities fit together with the specific calls on health in national climate policies, fossil fuel phase-out, financing, and climate-resilient low-carbon health systems, all contributing to the overarching call for action to achieve the Paris ambition of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius for a healthier and more equitable future for all. So, recognising the broad support for these issues and the consensus found in the prescription, we wanted to think about how we can translate this momentum into policy change. So this webinar is about how we can take these priorities forwards together in 2022. And we've organised the agenda today around these pillars. And I'm going to pass over now to Jess Beagley, GCHA's policy analyst, who's put together today's programme, for which we're very grateful, and she's going to lead us through most of the rest of the webinar. So just a reminder, questions in the bottom of the box, any other kind of comments or thoughts in the chat box. So thanks, and over to you, Jess.
Thanks so much, Alison, and to everyone for joining. Can I ask if there's anyone on the panel that isn't muted, if they could mute themselves? I'm getting a slight echo. Thank you very much. So we at GCHA, and more broadly in the climate and health community as well, I'm sure, believe that ambitious climate policy making is one of the best possible ways that we can be protecting public health. We also believe that a health narrative offers additional rationale for accelerated climate action. But for lots of us with a health background, getting to grips with the finer points of climate policy discussions so that we can contribute effectively to them can take a lot of time. And being able to speak the climate policy language is invaluable to be able to follow and participate in some of the more technical discussions. So we're really grateful that today's panel includes experts in the areas outlined in the prescription, both from the climate community and also from the health community. And we really hope that this webinar will be a chance for us to learn and exchange ideas between our respective communities and to think creatively and collaboratively across these four pillars, both in terms of NDCs and other national climate commitments, and also fossil fuel phase out, financing, and resilient low carbon sustainable health systems. And on the note of collaboration, we would really love to hear what you're working on this year, and whether it relates to these four pillars or beyond, and where we align and can be reinforcing each other's messaging. Many of you will already have received the link to our policy and network survey. It's open to both organisations and individuals. So please do consider filling it in, even if you haven't worked closely with GCHA in the past. We would really love to hear from you. And the deadline for that is the 25th of March. We'll post the link to the survey in the chat in a moment. And if I could have the next slide, please. We've got 5 guest speakers today covering the 4 pillars that Alison mentioned earlier. First of all, Leandro Vigna, who is Data Partnership and Outreach Manager for Climate Watch with the World Resources Institute, is going to speak to us about the national climate commitments that many of us are most familiar with, nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and will also tell us a little bit about long-term strategies. Then we're going to hear from Maria Pestakova, who is Senior Policy Advisor with E3G, which is a stellar policy think tank on the issue of fossil fuel phase out, an issue which much of the climate and health community has been engaged with for quite some time. And Maria will help us get to the next level. Then Leah Achampong, who is Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer with Eurodad, is going to speak to us on an issue which is quite a bit newer for many of us, and that's climate financing. Leah, we're really grateful to you for sharing your expertise on this. And then finally, we're going to hear from Elena Villalobos-Prats, who is Technical Officer with the World Health Organization, and from Josh Carliner, International Director of Programme Strategy, Healthcare Without Harm, who both of whom will already be familiar to many of you. Between them, they're going to cover the 2 priorities under the COP26 health programme commitments, which gained so much traction in Glasgow, with Elena speaking on climate resilient health systems and Josh on low carbon sustainable health systems. So without further ado, Milena will stop sharing our screen for us, and I'm delighted to pass now to Leandro, who's going to talk us through the current state of national climate commitments and to show us some excellent tools from the Climate Watch platform that will help us to track progress on the policies that are being submitted and the quality of them, as well as tools that will help us to understand how health features in them. Climate Watch's work is a really wonderful complement to the Healthy NDC scorecard that GCHA released last year. Once Leandro starts presenting, please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll save some of them for the end, but panelists will also be able to respond in writing throughout the webinar if there are things that are particularly pressing. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll pass now to Leandro.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. Really excited to be here presenting to all of you today. So as Jess said, my name is Leandro, and I work as the Outreach and Data Partners Manager for ClimateWatch, which is one of the data platforms from the World Resources Institute. Today, I'll take some time to drive you through a live demonstration of this platform and show you how you can find health-related topics that relates to the NDCs and other climate commitments. But before I do that and jump into the platform, I just want to do a quick refresher on what these climate commitments are and ClimateWatch more generally. So first, ClimateWatch is an online data platform that gathers data on historical greenhouse gas emissions from all countries and from different data sources, and also gathers insights from the main climate commitments around the world. And now I want to quickly explain what climate commitments I'm referring to. So as a refresher, you might be familiar with the Paris Agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycles of increasingly ambitious climate action carried out by countries. In every cycle, countries submit their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, communicating the actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the Paris Agreement goal. To better frame the efforts towards the long-term goal, the Paris Agreement invites countries to formulate and submit long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, or simply long-term strategies. These long-term strategies provide the long-term horizon to the NDCs, but unlike them, these are not mandatory. However, they place NDCs into the context of countries, long-term planning and development priorities, providing a vision and direction for future development. In addition, countries are also encouraged to adopt net zero targets by mid-century. And so with ClimateWatch, what we do, we analyze these 3 documents and we parse them out into different indicators so that it's easier for policymakers and everyone really interested in finding out more about what countries are bringing forward into the climate commitments. So it's also easier to compare. So having given that introduction, I'll be showing you mostly the connections on health with national determined contributions and the long-term strategies. So with that, I'm jumping into the platform right away. And also to remind any questions that you may have, I'll be happy to answer either in the chat or later in the panel. So getting started, this is the homepage of ClimateWatch, and I want to point your attention to this section here on the top bar menu, which is the commitments. So here's where you can find the most data-rich section of our platform. First, I want to focus on the Explore NDC. However, I mentioned that we also follow long-term strategies and net zero targets. We have them in here, Explore long-term strategies and the net zero tracker. I'll be showing you the long-term strategy explorer just in a minute. But here on the Explore NDC, we have a couple of things that you might find interesting related to your work on health. So as you can see, we have a map that shows by default the visualizations on the different categories and indicators that we have selected. We have over 160 indicators that you can select from. So as you open the page, you will see what countries have submitted a new version of their NDCs. In this case, 157 parties have a newer updated NDC, and only 37 parties have just the first one. Now, if you want to start digging deeper into perhaps the work that you're doing, I suggest that you first go to the category tab, and from here you scroll to the sectoral adaptation measures. So from here, we do have one indicator that is particularly related to health. So if you scroll down, you have agriculture, coastal zone, and you can go to health, and you will see what countries have a sectoral measure that's specified related to health. Now, if you want to dive even deeper into that, you can select on health, and you see that there's this arrow next to it. We have 6 extra sub-indicators that you can select from. So if you're interested, for example, in disease surveillance and control, you can click on that one and see, for example, that at least in our database, we don't see any country that's mentioning this specific thing. Although we do have, for example, some information on awareness, raising, and behavior change. So from here, It allows you to see individual countries, whether they mention that or not. And then you can also visualize individual submissions from EU member parties on the map. So this is really just the high-level indicators that we have across all countries related to health. But what happens if you are working on some niche topic that might be harder to find in one of these standardized indicators? So for that, we do have an alternative, and that is this section here, which is called the NDC keyword search. This is basically the Google for NDCs. So if you're working on a specific topic, let's say they're interested in knowing more about malaria, or whether countries are putting forward something related to malaria into their NDCs. You can type in the word and click enter. That will take you to the NDC search page, where you can see in the map, I have everything preloaded just in case. So you can see here, for example, that 77 documents representing 38 countries or parties to the UNFCCC mention malaria into their NDCs. Now, mentioning doesn't really mean that the country is actually putting forward something to address this. It might be that it's just naming that in a list of other things. So we also offer you this option where you can see every country and their specific document in which we have that connection into our NDCs. And if you collapse this, you can see, for example, Papua New Guinea has 22 results, but you can see within the context that maybe not all of those are the ones that you might be interested in. So I had to prepare the case of Malawi here, just 4 results, but if you go to one of them, you can see lifelong impacts on health and development and its associated increase in vulnerability to malaria. We can click there, and that will take us to the actual NDC and the specific section where there's a mention of malaria within the context of the NDC. So here we can see that this is within a table. The table, it's about the climate drivers and key risks per sector in Malawi. And we can see how the government of Malawi is recognizing that temperature increase and extreme temperature, extreme precipitation, it's going to be affecting the vector diseases such as malaria and increasing the negative effects of it. So in a similar way, you can see any other mentions that we have to malaria in Malawi's NDCs, or you can also search for other words. So for example, I had also prepared, in case we're interested in health. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of countries that mention those. However, I think for these kind of searches, it's more interesting to see which countries don't mention health than the ones that do it. And then again, if you're interested in seeing what context these topics are being considered, you can always dive deeper by clicking into this section here, the carousel, and then simply clicking them in the context that you might find most relevant. And then finally, I also prepare another search on nutrition. So just here, there it goes. Now, there's another module that I want to cover for you that's also found here, commitments, and then you can go to explore NDC SDG linkages. So similar to what I just showed, the connections between health or these keywords to the NDCs, our data team has gone through all the NDCs and then compared them to the Sustainable Development Goals. So, you know, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and then each of them have individual targets. So we have for each country, what's the connection and linkage that you can find between the NDC and each individual target. So as a health professional, you might most likely be interested in good health and well-being, SDG number 3. And then from here, you can see how all different targets are being or not considered into the different countries' NDCs. So you can take, as an example, SDG 3.9, which is to substantially reduce the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals in air, water, and soil pollution and contamination. We can see how many countries have a target that is linked to it, and then we can go down and perhaps click on any of those and see in what context this is being considered. So here, for example, improving health conditions might be achieved through establishing emission standards for vehicles, establishing exhaust testing sensors and cars that fail the test by emitting fumes above allowable emissions. And now different strategies that different countries might be taking to address this SDG in particular. And so these are 2 different ways of seeing what are the connections between health and NDCs. There's one more thing that I'd like to cover, and that is the long-term strategy module. So in this one, similarly to what I showed earlier in the NDC panel, in the NDC module, you can see the map with the countries that have submitted a long-term strategy. And then here on the top, we have two selectors, either by category and then by indicator. So here you can quickly see how countries compare between each other on all the different selectors that we have. So whether you're interested in what are the GHG target and you want to find out what are the target types, you can select on that particular indicator and see how the countries stack up differently. And here again, you can see the individual EU members. And if you want to find out more, perhaps in a table format, you can also scroll down. And for every single visualization that we show on the top, we're also offering an extra visualization here in a table format with links to the original documents, dates, and where you can also sort it out by dates to see what are the latest countries. That's immediately long-term strategy. Now, if you click on any country in particular, you can go to the long-term strategies page that we have first a summary, and then we have several indicators that you can select through to compare along countries on how they're doing, what are the net zero targets, and different considerations that we have. And so with this, I hope you have a better idea on how you can leverage the work that you're doing, whether it's a niche topic or not, and how ClimateWatch can help you as a database to gather all the data for that work. So with that, Jess, I don't know if I went over time or if we have some more minutes.
Thank you so much, Leandro. If there's more that you would like to cover, please do feel free. Don't let me stop you if you're full flow.
No, I only have one more thing to mention, is that to stay in touch with ClimateWatch, because we're planning a redesign of our country profile page. So here you'll be able to see for every single country a new analysis that we're working on with our adaptation team. That will have a ton of new sectors and subsectors, and it will be looking at the linkages between health, among other indicators, and the NDCs. So expand the selection that we have on linkages and connections. So I really encourage you to stay up to date on our page. You can go to the About and sign up for updates. And you can sign up here with your email. Hopefully next month, we'll be able to release that out. And back to you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Leandro. Leandro and GCHA spoke at one point last year while we were in the depths of the Healthy NDC scorecard work. And although I'd seen parts of the ClimateWatch data platform, I hadn't seen all of it. And I would really invite anyone that isn't yet familiar with it to go down that rabbit hole because it's a real treasure trove. And I think one of the things that's especially helpful is that there are different tools that measure different indicators, of course, and we know that just mentioning health, as Leandro was saying, isn't enough. And we really need ambitious emissions reductions and financing to match that and deliver on the Paris Agreement. And yeah, there are also tools that can compare the current NDC to a previous NDC in terms of its overall ambition. Leandro, I'm going to talk for a little bit longer, but there are some questions in the chat that you might already want to take a look at and decide if you want to respond now in case you need to dash off soon. And you could do that in writing or verbally in a moment. So let us know what you prefer. But while we're thinking about how health features in this broad scope of climate action and commitments, it's worth mentioning the global stocktake, which is currently ongoing, and it will conclude at COP28 in the UAE. The UNFCCC global stocktake takes place every 5 years to evaluate the progress that's made in implementing the Paris Agreement and therefore assess how much ambition should be increased in future NDCs. And GCHA made a submission to the process together with the Health and Climate Network back in February, and I'll post a link to that in the chat in a moment for anyone that's interested. It calls for greater attention to health in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, both in terms of the fact that progress is currently taking place at glacial pace, and this is insufficient to secure a healthy future, but also health gains are not currently being maximised in the work that's already being done. Leandro, I'll pass back to you to see if you would like to answer any of the questions that are in the chat right now, or if you prefer to take them in writing or at the end.
Yes, I think there's some quick ones, so happy to take them on. So the first one is, I'm interested to learn how strategic litigation can be used to advance global health and climate goals. Thank you. So on strategic litigation, we do have a partnership with the London School of Economics and the Graham Research Institute, where we do track and show into the country profile. To be aware, it's currently down because we're upgrading it and in the process of migrating this to the new design that will have tons of more information. But we are definitely going to bring it back. It's going to be somewhere here down the page that shows you for each country where the climate litigation policies, laws that each country has are related to climate change. So I would encourage you to go there, or at least from now, and I can share in the chat the link to the Graham Research Institute page, where you can find all this information that it's already gathered there, and see whether there are also connections to health within the actual laws that a country has already passed. And the next question is, has the Biden plan entered the NDC or LTS? Yet, still to come. The Biden plan, Alex has some more clarification on that. You can find out, however, all the information that we have if you go to the Explore LTS, long-term strategies, and then if you click into the country that you're interested in. So you'll find all the information here, and then also highlighting, we offer links to the original document. So if you want to see the document that the US submitted to the UNFCCC, you can come there and wait for that for every country. So it gives you access to the raw data to see it for yourself. And then I see last question. Does Climate Watch also monitor the contributions of transnational and large national corporations to the Paris climate goals and targets? That is a really good question. So the focus of Climate Watch is really on national governments. That's also why we do have a particular module on historical greenhouse gas emissions that focuses on countries. Same with the NDCs and climate commitments. Now, Reinhard, I will suggest you that you explore the science-based target page because I think they may have some more information on these large companies and large corporations to the university and to the Paris Agreement.
Thank you so much, Leandro, for covering everything that we asked for and even more, and still fitting it into an incredibly short amount of time. And with that brilliant introduction to the technical tools from Leandro, we're going to move into a deeper dive now on some of the policy opportunities around fossil fuel phase out. Fossil fuels were of course mentioned in the COP26 cover decision for the first time, and subsidies have featured in recent G7 and G20 leaders declarations. And the health community has been engaging in fossil fuel phase out for a number of years, both on account of the long-term impacts of fossil fuel driven climate change and short-term co-benefits of action relating to improved air quality. But the time now seems especially key to be pushing for specific and ambitious commitments at both national and international levels. So I'm delighted to pass over now to Maria Pastakova, who is Senior Policy Advisor at E3G. Thank you so much, Maria.
Many thanks, Jess, and hello everyone. Let me just quickly pause to share my screen. Here we go. So I think this is probably the most urgent moment now to really talk health and energy, particularly in the wake of what is happening on the energy markets and the spillover impact it has, not just on the commodity prices, but also on the overall human well-being, both in the global north and south. And let me maybe walk you through the outline of my presentation. First, I will very quickly go into the whole energy health nexus, and then run through the commitments that have been made last year at COP and other diplomatic fora, try to put them in the context of the war in Ukraine and the global impacts it has, particularly at the energy aspects of this, and maybe with a caveat that there is still quite a lot of uncertainty going around, and we still don't know how the energy markets, the energy prices, and the fossil fuel policies will develop this year, because the war is still ongoing. But I will have a final go in the final minutes of my presentation at kind of trying to outline what the priorities for this year can still be on phasing out fossil fuels and what other major fora we can engage to push for those. I'm talking to a group of experts, obviously. So this is probably most of you, something most of you already know, that the Sustainable Development Goals on energy and health are very, very closely related to each other. And energy is basically a major enabler for making progress on the human health front, not just the most known example of access to clean cooking and heating, which would then reduce indoors air pollution, or the clean transport, which contributes quite a lot to the urban quality of the urban air, but also the crucial importance of stable power supply and energy supply for the cooling chains, which is particularly important for vaccines, but also for maintaining the work of hospitals, as well as the equity and fairness aspect that energy can contribute via empowering the most vulnerable groups, children and women, particularly in the emerging markets and developing economies. And the overall energy as a kind of backbone of economic growth is a major driver of human well-being. So phasing out fossil fuels on the one side, but also enabling a decarbonized, resilient energy systems all over the world is a major prerequisite for the progress on the health front, of course. Last year, we have seen the structural shift we really need on the global energy transition emerging, not just with the over 130 countries proposed their own net zero pledges, but mid-century or a bit later, and over 60 countries actually naming the deadline for decarbonizing their economies. We have seen several pledges on shifting fossil fuel finance out of fossil fuels and towards clean energy. But also several investment initiatives emerging out of the diplomacy force, such as the Build Back Better World. China came forward with the Green BRI. There have been several connectivity initiatives that have targeted the build out of power grid infrastructure that should enable a ramp up of renewables and moving away from fossil-based power to clean power. And we have several emissions reduction commitments, probably on the fossil fuels front. The new direction has been the Global Methane Pledge, which for the first time in history really addressed fossil gas as a major threat to the climate goals. We also have seen first attempts at sketching out the timelines for decarbonization of the global energy sector, of the global economy, and fossil fuel phase out, of course, is a major part of this, but it is only one part, and probably the most important thing that needs to be delivered this year and the years ahead is this major shift of financial flows away from the global north to emerging markets and developing economies. Which are still very much reliant on the fossil fuels, but also very much in need of the investment into the reliable alternatives. Maybe let me quickly go through what we see happening now as the kind of a consequence of the war in Ukraine. And what it effectively means for the changes in the global energy landscape. As you see on this chart, so we see that the Russian invasion has really wrecked the global energy markets, and the impact is in fact global, because fossil fuel markets are now deeply interconnected, not just oil, but coal and gas as well. And prices have been surging not just in Europe, but also globally, and hitting among all also vulnerable economies in the global south, which as a consequence has also risk of stalled progress of clean energy access. We have seen last year some commitments to ramp up clean energy solutions for rural energy access. Liquid petroleum gas is of course not an ideal solution in the long term, but has been one of the most efficient short-term solutions for granting cleaner indoor cooking and heating. And with the LPG prices now surging as well, it is now a big question whether the progress can be made this year. we are now seeing the risk of rebound on fossil fuel policies, fossil fuel subsidy policies, both in the global north and south. Particularly in the global south, we see that countries that are very much reliant on the imports of fossil fuels, for example, India, are now rethinking their fossil fuel subsidy policies and are effectively thinking through whether to put brakes on progress here in order to shield the vulnerable communities from the rising prices. We see also the disruption of supply value chains happening right now, and these are not just crucial for boosting the shift away from fossil fuels, but also for granting the overall resilience of the economies in the global south to the ongoing crisis. What we also see now as a kind of a backlash on the level of ambition that has been delivered last year is this wave of new plans to invest in oil and gas production, but also in the oil and gas transport infrastructure, particularly liquefied natural gas, not just in the OECD countries, but also among African fossil fuel producing countries such as Nigeria, Tanzania, and Algeria. These are now very quick reactions to the price shocks on the global market and the seeming supply crunch when it comes to LNG and oil. Which however, if now really proceeded with, might end up being stranded in the next couple of years, because neither Europe nor the US, the major consumers of this or potential consumers of this gas, are not planning to give up on their climate goals and will continue reducing their oil and gas demand in the coming years. On what 2022 can actually help us deliver on phasing out fossil fuels. First of all, what is really needed is to maintain the level of ambition that has been reached last year, while supporting the emerging markets and developing economies in the times of the ongoing crisis and helping them to actually come on board with these initiatives. I've quickly run through what commitments have been made last year. Probably the most significant of those have been the phase out of international coal finance and the COP26 commitment to phase down coal use, but also the Glasgow statement on shifting finance away from fossil fuels and into clean energy. The net zero power goals that have been announced by several industrialized countries, and now recently by Germany in February 2022. And then we have maybe just to very quickly pause here. I think what is important really is not just to talk about fossil fuel phase out, because this is not something that we can do as a standalone kind of project. We need to talk at the same time about phasing in clean energy alternatives and enabling the structural shift to clean energy, because we also can't effectively replace 1 gigawatt, say, of coal-based power by 1 gigawatt of renewables-based power. We really need to talk about all of the systemic change that need to contribute to this, including energy efficiency, including capacity building and job creation on the ground. So these commitments that need to be kind of pursued this year are not just related to the fossil fuel phase out, but also to ramping up clean energy access. Glasgow Breakthrough addressed those last year, particularly the breakthroughs on clean power and on clean road transport are most relevant here. And when we look at the 2022 energy diplomacy timeline, we see that we have, first of all, quite a lot of uncertainty now over what Fora can actually deliver this year. The hopes have been, of course, this year put quite a lot on the G7 and G20, particularly because of the active cooperation between Germany and in Indonesia, the hosts of both these groups that have been ongoing in the recent years. Also, the ambition of both countries to lead on this during this year, and now with the war raging in Ukraine, we see G20 effectively crippled right now, because Russia, one of the G20 countries, is of course getting quite a lot of pushback by many other G20 countries, and this fora is very likely not to deliver on any ambition and risk ending up as a kind of a talk shop without any new commitments. It is still quite uncertain whether United Nations General Assembly will be able to deliver for the same reason. COP27 is also well. Let's see where we get there, because with the global basically economic crisis now unraveling, development and maintaining resilience of the global South economies will be the major focus. Phasing out fossil fuels might be not one of the top priorities that will need to be on the agenda, understandably, of course. Nevertheless, there are several fora that can deliver this year. G7 is being one of them, and it is really kind of a make it or break it moment for the G7 countries to prove the group's credibility towards the global South, and come forward with new commitments to deliver not just on ambition at home, but also in boosting global energy transition by putting on the table concrete investment sums, concrete benchmarks for sectoral investments in energy, and solidarity packages for the most vulnerable countries. We see now a moment where the transatlantic cooperation between the EU and the US can really make some progress on phasing out fossil fuels, not just at home, but also globally. This has been stated shortly during the US Energy Council that has taken place last month, but also given that the US is hosting several of the diplomatic platforms this year, including the Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation here in late September. Now is actually the moment for these countries to coordinate the actions to kind of to deliver on ambition and deliver the clear support to the global South countries when it comes to energy transition. So let me maybe as last slide very quickly go through the priorities for this year. These are the priorities that are more or less adjusted to the crisis that is ongoing in Europe. But as I said, there is still too much uncertainty around where we will be in the next couple of weeks. So this is more of a temporary recommendation and not a final, not a final statement. So definitely the major focus needs to be on clean energy access and on addressing most vulnerable groups in the emerging markets and developing economies. As I said, G7 really needs to deliver on this. G20 might be able to deliver on this. This has been actually the priority there. Let's see what the fora gets. And of course, the Sustainable Energy for All Kigali Forum will need to focus on this. Their energy efficiency really needs to be considered the fuel number one, not just in Europe, not just in the US, but also in the developing countries for boosting their own resilience against the price shocks that are now ongoing on the energy markets. We have seen that gas, oil, and coal are really super volatile, not just when it comes to the supply, but also to the prices. And it exposes particularly the developing countries to price shocks. So the less or the more in control the countries are over its energy demand, and energy efficiency is really one of the major instruments to help do this, the better. Which is why energy efficiency should really be one of the main priorities this year. And we need some concrete benchmarks, national, international, on how much needs to be invested in energy efficient appliances, on how much percent of the buildings needs to be insulated and refurbished, particularly in the countries where with colder climate, and so on and so forth. We really need to put the capacity gaps and job creation on the agenda of fora that are now driven by the US and the European Union in dialogue with developing countries, be it the Clean Energy Ministerial Mission Innovation, the US Africa Leaders Forum, which we still don't know when it happens, but it should happen this year, or within the European Union, African Union cooperation. What we, even if the investment is on the table, what we're really lacking right now is skilled personnel and on the ground in these countries to make a change happen, which means capacity building is probably one of the top priorities for this year as well. We have major investment initiatives that kick off last year, and this year they really need to come forward with clear timelines on what parts of the large scale infrastructure. They will support prioritizing power distribution infrastructure will be really key, particularly for securing stable power supply for crucial public facilities, including public health facilities. There are, of course, the priorities, particularly on fossil fuel phase out. On coal, quite a lot of progress has been achieved last year already. And now what is really needed is to stop the pipeline of plant coal power plants, particularly of the most polluting coal power plants, the so-called subcritical coal, but also come forward with the global commitment to phase out coal by 2040. That is what really ideally needs to happen throughout the global for this year. And of course, a more ambitious phase out language is necessary. The language on energy transition, phasing out fossil fuels at COP26 has been for the first time put in the declaration, but has been watered down from phase out to phase down, and this cannot happen this year as well. The ambition level needs to be maintained and heightened, so we need to talk about coal phase out this year. On oil and gas, this is of course now a much more tricky topic with the global energy price and supply crisis ongoing, but nevertheless, the ambitions that have been put on the table last year need to deliver, including the Glasgow Statement on fossil fuel finance, but also now the industrialized countries have quite a lot of homework to do, and also to deliver proof points for the developing countries. The transition away from oil and gas can happen and can happen quickly. So there are already some policies put in place by the European Union. For example, one of them is the most recent Repower Europe energy strategy that now really need to start delivering, also to show to the world that the transition is not some fantasy and can actually happen also within and amidst the global economic crisis. And it is not just something that the countries are doing for the sake of climate, but something the country are doing for the sake of their own economic resilience and for the sake of the human well-being, which of course includes human health. I will stop here. Apologies if I have been talking for too long. Looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Maria, thank you so much for that incredibly rich overview, and especially for helping us prioritize what's coming up in 2022 and where it might be easier or more challenging to make progress. In light of the fact that we have 3 more speakers and only about 40 minutes, can I suggest, Maria, if you want to flag in the chat if there are questions that you want to answer live later on, and if you respond to any others in writing, and then we could move straight on now to Leah's presentation. Milena, would you be able to share the screen again so that we have Leah's slides up? But Maria, thank you so much. To introduce Leah's presentation of the none of the actions that we're calling for can of course happen without financing. It's fundamental to all of the other calls that we make. There is global pressure to mitigate, which has benefits in that it both prevents health impacts and offers health co-benefits. We know from the Lancet Countdown that emissions reductions in line with the Paris Agreement across the energy, food and agriculture and transport sectors would prevent 1.18 million air pollution related deaths, 5.86 million diet related deaths, and 1.15 million deaths due to physical activity in just 9 countries every year by 2040. But while financing is lacking overall, including for mitigation, the biggest gaps are in adaptation, which also presents a severe challenge for health in countries which are already faced with severe climate impacts as a result of historical fossil fuel consumption, most especially by global north countries, and financing for loss and damage, which includes health impacts that have occurred due to insufficient mitigation and adaptation, is next to non-existent. But I'll pass now to Leah, and thank you so much, Milena, for the slides.
Hi everyone, and thanks Jess for the introduction. Hello, good morning, afternoon and evening to you all, and thanks for inviting me here today. I'm Leah Achampong and I work at the European Network on Debt and Development on International Climate Finance for developing countries. Just to say, I apologise now for having such text-heavy slides. Next slide, please. So the idea of today's session is to go over why is climate finance needed, climate finance timeline, Paris Agreement articles on climate finance. I'll go over a few trends and then also list some of the outcomes on climate finance from COP26, and then also look at some climate finance opportunities this year, and then look ahead to COP27. Next slide, please. So why is climate finance needed? Two main reasons. One is vulnerabilities, the other is equity. In terms of vulnerabilities, historical global emissions show us that developed countries have contributed the most to climate change, whilst developing countries experience the worst impacts. This is something that the upcoming Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3 and Synthesis reports are expected to highlight. And the recent IPCC Working Group 2 report on adaptation impacts and vulnerabilities specifically shows that the most vulnerable geographies are small islands and coastlines, and that the most vulnerable regions are West, Central and East Africa, the dry corridor of Central America, South Asia and the South Pacific. So clearly developing countries in the global South are the most affected. In terms of equity, whilst climate change is a global issue, the additional vulnerabilities that developing countries in the global South face from climate impacts, despite contributing the least, means that countries have common but differentiated responsibilities to tackling climate change. This point on common but differentiated responsibilities is clearly enshrined in the Convention of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Additionally, the UNFCCC states that the right to new and additional climate finance from developed countries is enshrined in Article 4, and Article 3.4 states that developing countries in the global South have the right to economic development whilst tackling climate change. It's really important that international climate finance comes from public climates for equity purposes, and because public climate finance from developed countries tends to target economy-wide emissions reductions projects, whereas the data shows that private finance, climate finance flows tend to focus on projects that produce the most profits. It's also important that climate finance is new and additional in order to ensure that finance is not diverted away from existing financial commitments, such as official development assistance or humanitarian aid. And this is something that the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development also highlights, with them stating that development finance and climate finance have distinct roles and aims. As such, conflating these budgets would not lead to either climate or development agendas being achieved. However, as we'll see from the climate finance trend slide, this is not always the case. Next slide, please. So in terms of the climate finance timeline, in 2008, the World Bank's Climate Investment Funds, CIF, were founded. The CIF is largely funded by developed countries and largely provides climate finance in the form of loans. Civil society activists, particularly civil society activists in developing countries in the global South, have called for a sunset clause to be triggered to ensure that the majority of climate finance flows through the Green Climate Fund, which has better environmental, social, gender, and civil society engagement measures in place. In 2019, at COP15, developed countries agreed to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020. This is the existing global climate finance goal. That same year, there was a G20 commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. In 2010, at COP16, countries agreed the Cancun agreements, where developed countries formalized the commitment to jointly mobilize 100 billion per year by 2020. And then at that same COP, the Green Climate Fund was established, and also the Adaptation Fund began funding projects, despite the Adaptation Fund having been set up in 2001 under the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol preceded the Paris Agreement. And then in 2011, the Green Climate Fund became an operating entity, but it didn't begin dispersing funds until 2016. In terms of climate, next slide please, sorry. In terms of climate finance being reflected in the Paris Agreement, the key articles on finance are Article 9, which is on international climate finance for developing countries, Article 2.1c, which is on sustainable finance flows. Additionally, COP21 in 2015 is the COP where the Paris Agreement was agreed, and every COP produces an outcomes and/or decision text. The COP21 decision text is where the decision to extend the current climate finance goal from 2020 to 2025 is contained. Additionally, the COP21 decision text agrees that the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, and the Least Developed Countries Fund shall serve the Paris Agreement. And then COP24 in 2018 decided that the Adaptation Fund shall serve the Paris Agreement as well. This is significant because it ensures that the measures and any national legislations that are meant to serve the achievement of the Paris Agreement can be served and financed by these different funds. So that's significant. Next slide, please. There are several worrying trends that are contributing to the existing climate finance gap. Including that global climate finance is conservatively currently estimated at between 4.5 and 5 trillion US dollars annually by 2030, if the world is to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Yet total climate finance in 2019 amounts to just 79.6 billion USD. Worryingly, the 2021 Climate Finance Delivery Plan from developed countries shows that the current global 100 billion goal won't be achieved until 2023 and is only predicted to be surpassed in 2024. So there's a clear gap between the climate finance that's being provided and the actual needs of countries. Another worrying aspect is that public loans in 2019 accounted for 71%, whereas grants just 27%. Given the link between debt and loan repayments, including surcharges and fees, it's concerning that loans are still being used so much. Additionally, despite the Paris Agreement stating that developed countries should track gender considerations in climate finance, less than 30% of climate-related projects for 2019 climate finance flows were actually gender tagged, with mitigation projects being tagged the least, despite mitigation measures being the most funded. And additionally, 70 times more finance has gone to fossil fuels via G20 countries as international public climate finance institutions in a 1-year period than in the 20-year history of the Adaptation Fund. So these trends are pretty worrying, particularly given that in the 2021 NDC synthesis report, developing countries highlighted that they needed money for adaptation, particularly community-based adaptation, but also finance to address loss and damage, in addition to finance for mitigation flows. So all of these trends form a very worrying picture and help to enable our understanding of the existing global climate finance gap. Next slide, please. In terms of outcomes on finance at COP26 last year, there were 17 direct agenda items on finance with several more indirect agenda items. So I'm only going to cover a few of the finance outcomes. So a process was agreed to decide a new collective climate finance goal by 2024, known as the New Collective Quantified Goal, or the NCQG, another acronym to add to your list. The technical meetings for the NCQG, the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance, will start next week at a session in South Africa from the 24th to the 25th. And I'm not sure if the registration process has closed, but if you are interested, you should be able to sign up to the different technical meetings on this new goal throughout the year. The long-term climate finance work program will continue until 2022 this year. This was a big requirement from developing countries in the global south, since this is where work around the 100 billion goal, the existing climate goal, as well as work around quantity and needs can also be discussed. So that was that was a small win for countries that are in need of international climate finance. Additionally, a progress report on the current 100 billion climate finance goal will be presented at COP27. Okay, so sadly registration has closed, but there'll be other technical meetings throughout the year that people can sign up to if they are interested. In terms of adaptation finance, what was agreed at COP26 is that it would be at least doubled based on 2019 levels. However, when we look closely at the 2019 adaptation finance amounts from the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, it shows that 2019 adaptation finance amounts to just 20.1 billion USD. At this level of ambition, a doubling would only amount to 40.2 billion for adaptation finance, which falls far short of the 50 billion minimum that climate vulnerable countries have been calling for. So whilst it might look good that an agreement was made to double, this doubling isn't actually as good as what would be needed. Importantly, finance to address loss and damage will be formally discussed as part of the Glasgow Dialogue on Loss and Damage and the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. This is significant because finance to address loss and damage is something that has been asked for a number of years, but hasn't been provided for. At COP26, what was called for was a Glasgow Dialogue, or a Glasgow facility on loss and damage. However, at the last moment, if this was downgraded to simply a dialogue, it's important to ensure that the various processes this year related to finance do not limit finance to address loss and damage to these processes, but do ultimately result in an actual loss and damage finance facility being set up. And so the opportunities for that do include ensuring that the new collective climate finance goal does include a specific goal on finance to address loss and damage. Also agreed at COP26 were common tabular format tables. The acronym for this, confusingly, is CTFs. And there's another acronym on CTFs under the UNFCCC work stream, so that adds to the confusion. But these common tabular format tables will be used to track climate finance transparency. There's a lot of interesting points in there, so I encourage you to read them if you can, but just quickly to flag that aspects relating to the grant equivalency of loans are not mandatory, they're voluntary. So it's important that we all get national governments to ensure that the equivalency of loans, grant equivalency of loans are actually tracked. That will help to build up a better picture on how many loans are actually being used to disperse climate finance. Additionally, the tables allow for different finance flows to be tracked. However, financial flows for loss and damage cannot be tracked as a financial flow, but can only be listed under additional information. This is significant because at COP26 we saw that several sub-national governments, specifically Scotland in the UK and Wallonia in Belgium, as well as a group of philanthropies, pledged finance for loss and damage. And if we can't track that as a financial flow, it's difficult to build up a picture on what the future climate finance gap may be. Next slide, please. So in terms of climate finance opportunities this year, and a number of them are similar to the ones that were shared by Maria, so thank you. But what we're just to flag that we have the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3 report that will come out on April 4th, which will cover mitigation and economic aspects. We also have the G7 summit in June, where we expect there to be a G7 climate risk financing plan announced, as well as a plan on loss and damage finance as well. We also have the Ministerial on Climate Action in July, which is a joint opportunity. It's a joint meeting between, which is jointly hosted by the European Union, China and Canada, where they invite a group of approximately 30 countries to come together and discuss at a political level technical issues. So it's a really significant opportunity to ensure that different financial aspects can be raised at a political level and not just only be discussed within technical meetings. We also have the Petersburg Climate Dialogue that's also taking place in July. The Petersburg Climate Dialogue is an initiative from Germany, and they will jointly be hosting that with the COP27 president, Egypt. I won't go through too many more, but I also wanted to flag that there will be, in November, there will be the Financing Common Summit in Africa. The Financing Common Summit is a global summit of multilateral development banks. All of the world's multilateral development banks come together to have discussions around different relevant issues. And this year, one of the issues that will be highlighted is financing through the use of liquidity instruments, such as special drawing rights, for instance. So it's an opportunity to flag some climate finance demands there as well. I will now move on to sorry, I also wanted to flag that in the second half of this year, there will be a meeting of the E3F, which is a coalition of countries that agreed to work together on fossil fuel subsidy phase out. I checked when I last checked the documents, they did not have a specific date in mind. It just said second half of this year, but that's another significant opportunity in terms of fossil fuel subsidy reform as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of Eurodad's climate finance demands, they are for new and additional climate finance to address loss and damage via a new loss and damage finance facility. Adaptation finance must reach a minimum of 50 billion USD. Grants must be prioritized, particularly for adaptation. Climate finance must be needs and rights-based as well as gender responsive. There must be an inclusive process to set the new global climate finance goal, and financial support must be accurately tracked. So I will leave it there, and sorry if I've gone over time. Could you move to the next slide, please? System change, not climate change, in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. I've learned so much from you in the last 10 or so minutes, and really do appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. it's in the health sector's interests as much as any other for developed countries to be delivering on and exceeding the 100 billion target, and to massively ramp up financing for loss and damage and adaptation. But even at the current levels of climate financing, there's just a tiny fraction allocated to health, as I'm sure that many on this webinar are already aware. But the current estimate is a little less than 1%, and I'll post a paper in the chat by Paul Watkiss and Christy Eby in a moment. Leah, I wonder if you could, if there's anything that you would suggest as introductory reading for those of us that climate financing is still relatively new. If you might be willing to share that in the chat at some point before the end of the webinar, that would be really wonderful. But I'll pass now to our final two presenters that we're going to hear from, Elena and Josh. Elena will take us through the COP26 health programme and tell us about WHO's work on climate resilient health systems and what's coming up in 2022. And then we'll move immediately to Josh to tell us about what Healthcare Without Harm is working on to support health systems to reduce their carbon footprint as part of the cross-sectoral transition emissions reductions. These presentations are highly complementary. So I'll pass now to Elena. Thank you, Elena.
Hi, can you kindly confirm that you can see my screen in full?
No, we can see just like your slides, but we can still see the PowerPoint. Like we can see your PowerPoint window, but not the full presentation, if that makes sense.
So I think, Elena, if you go to slideshow and the menu at the top.
I already did it, but maybe the size is enough.
It's
yeah,
okay.
it's fine as it is.
Thank you
So
so
I
much.
suggest to go ahead just in case, because I am aware of lack of time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Okay. So basically, I will try to be as fast as possible and to give a brief overview of how health was integrated in COP26. Basically, this year was a very important year for the health community because WHO was working very closely with the UK as president of the COP. And basically, we were working with them to ensure that under all their priorities, health was properly defined. And these are the key campaigns for the COP, and then the health argument is integrated below. So just as an example, energy transition, you see that basically the health angle was to guide a rapid transition to clean renewable energy, to save lives from air pollution, particularly from coal combustion. Everybody got to the COP basically looking at the NDCs because, as you know, this was the key priority to ensure that we are still able to reach the 1.5 goal. I will not go into detail because I think this has been covered in detail before. Something that was very important also overall for the health community was the COP26 special report on climate change and health, which basically represented the inputs and the views from all the health community. And this report was facilitated by WHO, but then basically had all health and climate change experts and agencies and partners designing 10 recommendations and concrete steps to deliver an ambitious renewal of the Paris Agreement with a strong focus on biodiversity, also in line with the WHO Manifesto for a Green and Healthy Recovery from COVID. This report was released on October 11th, just before the COP. And then it was done together with the Healthy Climate Prescription Letter, which was signed by over 400 health organizations, representing over 45 million health professional workers, including Dr. Tedros. But basically, if you think about it, these 45 million health professionals backing up a letter I think is a huge development. The most concrete action, I would say, at least for follow-up with countries, were the 4 initiatives on health, which were basically promoted by the UK. One referred to climate resilient health systems, another one to health leadership in emission reductions, which is the one that Josh from Healthcare Without Harm will further talk about. Another one is basically promoting healthy NDCs. And then another one mobilizing the health voices for climate action. Under the initiatives on climate resilient and low carbon sustainable health systems, this is basically the area of work that I was focusing more because I'm responsible for capacity building and country support. And then these are the commitments that were included under those initiatives. Basically, countries were committing to conduct a climate change and health vulnerability and adaptation assessment, building on this evidence, then develop comprehensive health national adaptation plans, then use that evidence and that plan to seek for funding opportunities for climate change and health, of course, adaptation, but also potentially health co-benefits from mitigation or anything related to low carbon sustainable health systems. And then with regards to the initiative on low carbon sustainable health systems, the commitments were related to committing to set a target date by which achieve health system net zero emissions, that for high emitters or high ambition countries. Then all countries committed to deliver a baseline assessment of the emissions in health systems, including supply chains, and also commit to develop an action plan for reducing their emissions. As outcomes of the COP, basically, we were surprised to see, as of today, we have 48. There's a new country, Palestine, that committed to these commitments, and basically, this is growing little by little because countries that were contacted at the beginning basically are continuing to follow up with WHO on this. I will not go into details on the outcome of the COP because I think it was clear from previous presentations. Basically, WHO Health Program on climate change and health has 3 key areas of work. One is addressing the wide range of health impacts from climate change. A second one related to strengthening the climate resilience and environmental sustainability of health systems and facilities. And the third one, promoting the health co-benefits of climate change mitigation in other sectors. I will not go into detail in everything we do. This is the summary of our country support. Basically, we support countries to assess health risk and co-benefits, develop plans, get funding for climate change and health, implement interventions at country level, and then monitor progress on climate change and health. Sorry if I'm being a little bit fast on this. And then this is the last slide and probably the most important, which are the next steps for WHO for the implementation of country commitments. Basically, we are supporting countries to implement the commitments related to climate resilient and low carbon sustainable health systems by organizing technical support activities related to the commitments, online trainings, face-to-face trainings, provision of technical support throughout the implementation of the commitments, basically hand-holding while they are implementing those, provision of some activity money for those countries that are ready to implement, updating the technical support package based on country needs and our interaction with countries, and then convening the community of practice and promoting sharing of experiences among countries. Specifically to climate resilient health systems, basically this is an approach to supporting countries. What you see on the left below is the operational framework for building climate resilient health systems, which is looking at the 6 building blocks of health systems, and then around those we developed 10 functions that should be strengthened at health system level to ensure that those systems become resilient to climate change. What you see in the right is basically how this is further developed to work at healthcare facility level, both for resilience and low carbon sustainability. Basically, we have 4 components, and around those we propose interventions to improve both resilience and reduce the environmental impact of health operations. With this, I think I will finish and then give the pass over to Josh. Sorry if it was fast.
Thank you very much, Elena. I'm going to share my screen as well. Hi, everybody. I can't share the screen while you're sharing, so I think I need to close it. There we go. All right. Let's see if this works.
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. And going to full screen, hopefully. Okay, so it's working.
You're not at full screen yet, but we can see
Okay.
your slides.
Okay, I hit full screen. All right, so my slides are big, so hopefully I'm not going to waste any time here. What a set of fascinating presentations, and I think they all sort of interface and overlap with what Elena and I are talking about. So I guess I want to just very briefly provide a little bit of context from the Healthcare Without Harm perspective, which is that in 2019, we released the first ever global estimate of healthcare's climate footprint. We found that healthcare contributed to 4.4% of net global emissions. That estimate has been corroborated by a number of academic studies subsequently. And building on that, almost a year ago, we released the Global Roadmap for Healthcare Decarbonization, which kind of laid out a vision for how healthcare could align with the Paris Agreement and the ambition of the Paris Agreement and get to net zero emissions with climate resilience and health equity. And as Elena mentioned, much to our surprise, things moved really quickly. A couple things happened. One is the NHS made its net zero commitment and began really moving on that, which provided a significant amount of leadership. And then the other was that we got together with WHO and the UK COP presidency and were put together these set of commitments that we urged governments to join on to in the lead up to COP 26. And so lo and behold, we have now 57 countries making those commitments. This was in the middle of the COP, this New York Times headline, 40. By the end of the COP, it was 52. We're now at 57. So there's growing momentum around the world for national health ministries to actually engage on these issues. And so this is sort of the significant context in which sort of the next steps are happening. The other piece that I want to refer to is that Healthcare Without Harm has also been the lead for the healthcare component of Race to Zero. And so parallel to national governments committing non-state actors, which includes state governments or provincial governments, as well as public and private health systems around the world, we've got 50 healthcare institutions representing more than 14,000 hospitals and health centers in 21 countries committing to net zero healthcare as well. So there's a groundswell from the bottom up as well as from the top down around healthcare decarbonization. And of course, that interfaces quite closely with resilience. So that's a very fast background. And so what are the next steps? I guess, first of all, what I want to say is that this is an issue that some of us have been working on for a really long time. And all of a sudden it is coming into the mainstream. And so we're seeing many new actors or many mainstream health sector actors getting involved around these issues, which is really good news. And so there are a lot of next steps, I think, that are going to happen in a lot of different ways from a lot of different corners of the world and a lot of different parts of the sector, which is super exciting. And there's a great opportunity for interface with what you might call the climate sector, organizations working on climate change to start taking on health. In terms of Healthcare Without Harm's work, our goal here is to support countries that committed to the COP26 health program by providing the tools and resources for them to conduct baselining, for them to do action planning, for them to decarbonize their supply chain, which is more than 70% of healthcare emissions, and to access climate finance. I think, again, so the finance piece is super important here. And there does need to be a lot of new and additional climate finance to address to solve the climate crisis, and more of that needs to go to the health sector. WHO's made that really clear. They've documented how little goes to the health sector, but also, health development assistance is $25 billion a year. And so it's our responsibility as a sector to transform that assistance, not diminish it, but transform it so that it's climate smart, just the way it's the responsibility of national governments to do the same. We're working with WHO and the UK COP presidency to follow up on the COP26 health program and to begin to develop the outlines of a partnership that governments can take up to actually move these commitments forward. So we hope to be able to talk about that soon, what that intergovernmental partnership might look like. We are also, as Healthcare Without Harm, working with several governments, working with the government of Netherlands and Portugal and Georgia and Region Lazio of Italy, all in Europe, to basically do that baselining at a national level and create those action plans. It's something called Operation Zero that Healthcare Without Harm Europe is carrying out. We're working with the US government and the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the US National Academy of Medicine, to build momentum to decarbonize the US health sector. We're working with the governments of Colombia and Peru to do bottom-up baselining and carbon footprint measurement in health facilities. We have an MOU with the Ministry of Health of Colombia to move forward, and are working, as I said, with Peru. We're also working in exploring in Southeast Asia and Africa and South Asia how to do this work to support models of implementation of these commitments. And all of this has to do also, just harkening back to some of the other presentations, so it has to do with the measurement and tracking, which was the first presentation. It has to do with moving away from fossil fuels, in that healthcare's footprint, 84% of it comes from fossil fuel production and not fossil fuel use. And so decarbonizing healthcare means moving away from fossil fuels and toward clean, renewable energy and energy efficiency and greater access to healthcare. So, all of this is happening. We're working with UNDP to build a second phase of our supply chain work, which is called the Sustainable Health and Procurement Project, that will have a strong focus on climate to take on the supply chain. And while at the same time working with a European Market Transformation Network that we're developing there, as well as a lot of supply chain work in the US. So we're working around the world to try to put some of the building blocks in place to implement the COP26 health program, while at the same time working from the ground up to support health facilities to measure and begin to reduce their footprint. We have a tool called the Checkup Tool, and we're again working with WHO to disseminate that, as well as across our networks, as well as with other organizations that are building similar tools. And I guess the final thing I want to say here, and I know we're like at the end of the webinar, and it's like I wish there was more time for discussion, because I bet there's a lot of interesting things people on this call have to say. But the health sector's voice is super, super important. And the movement for healthcare climate action and for decarbonization and resilience in the health sector is intimately interconnected with the broader health movement around climate that has emerged in the last decade. And so that sort of brings us right back to the health professionals letter and the importance of that health voice in reinforcing and supporting action at all levels. I will pass it back to the GCHA team right at the end of time.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Josh. And thank you to Eleanor as well for drawing out these themes about health sector commitments and all the momentum that's going there. And to Josh, thank you very much for pulling together some of the threads across the themes today and how they relate to the health sector and the health community voice. So thanks to all our speakers today. We're sorry we ran out of time for more discussion, but the speakers have done a fantastic job in the Q&A, providing answers to the questions, and there's been some great material shared in the chat box. And we're also going to be sharing a recording of this on our GCHA YouTube channel, so all that material will be available. So all I can do now is thank our speakers for sharing their knowledge and insights so generously. What we aim to do today has really been met. The presentations have given us so much rich detail about the 2022 outlook on the policy calls that are included in the Healthy Climate Prescription, which provides us with our consensus this year. Right across national climate plans, fossil fuel phase out, financing, and of course, progress in the health sector and health sector commitments. So thanks to the speakers and thanks to you all for joining us. Please do fill in our policy survey if you get a chance, so we can see where your organisations are working across these issues. And do please keep a lookout for our future webinars on specific policy priorities. We're really hoping to build the dialogue within the health community and with these climate policy experts and other organisations. So please do stay tuned for more opportunities to deepen our learning and to develop our collective approach. So thank you all so much, and thank you to Jess for organising today's event. So thanks all.